Dear viewers, dear listeners, today we're in the studio with Edward Luukas. Tere, Edward.
Tere, Luukas.
So it's a real pleasure to talk with you, and I think most Estonians know you primarily as a former editor of The Economist, as a columnist whose columns also appear frequently in the Estonian press. But you have a bit of a new career move that you've been undertaking recently.
Yes, I'm still writing my column for The Times, and also my column that appears in the Estonian press, among others, and I'm still at the think tank in Washington, SIPA. But I am also the parliamentary candidate for the cities of London and Westminster, which is the basically central London, for the Liberal Democrats. And I've been doing that since September 2021. And, of course, the Liberal Democrats are the sister party of the Reform Party here in Estonia, also of our Canadian Liberals, not doing so well, and the Taiwanese DPP, who are doing great.
Well, it's a pleasure to welcome a fellow Liberal and a fellow young or fresh politician to the studio then.
Yes, it's quite a cold bath getting out of the world where you tell politicians what to do to being a politician who's trying to get the voters interested in what you think needs to be done.
Absolutely. Pressing the flesh and being out there at the county fairs.
Yes, not so many county fairs in central London, but we do have farmers markets where you sell vastly overpriced organic produce. And there's a great deal of what the Americans say, doors win wars, a great deal of door knocking. And we go door knocking every day for a couple of days, because whereas you have your list system in Estonia, where there's competition between the parties for their lists, and then in your open list competition among the many excellent reform candidates to get the 2 or 3 slots you're going to get in the parliament. Our system is, as in Belarus, first past the post, which punishes the third party, so we have to bootstrap our way to victory.
And winner takes all.
It's exactly, yes, first past the post.
So how are you going to do? I mean, the UK is slated to have elections sometime this year.
Yes, and we're heading for a Labour majority government. Initially, the expectation was there would probably be a hung parliament, which is unusual in Britain, completely normal in the rest of Europe, where no one party has an overall majority. And that would give the Liberal Democrats, along with possibly some Greens, Scottish nationalists, Welsh nationalists, the Northern Irish parties, a bit of leverage. And so there would be a lot of interest in what we would be able to extract from the likely Labour government. That's changed now. It now looks as though Labour is going to have a majority of between 50 or 100 or even more than that, because the Conservatives are in such meltdown. Now, for me, that slightly changes the argument to my constituency. So instead of saying vote, it's a Conservative-held constituency, so instead of saying vote Liberal Democrat to beat the wicked Conservatives, instead I'm saying you've got a Labour government, you've got a Labour council in Westminster run by the Labour Party, we have a Labour mayor of London, so there's a Labour landslide.
So now you're saying beat Labour.
Don't you want to have an independent, strong-minded, experienced voice as your MP, rather than some obedient Labour Party hack who'll do as she's told?
Well, we are going to cross our fingers and hope you do well. We have many other elections this year. One of the sets of many elections happening globally is the EU election, or the European Parliament election. How do people in Britain look at what's going on in Europe? The big drama for the elections is going to be the question of just how many seats the far right takes, and whether that changes the coalition politics in the European Parliament.
I think Britain's never really, even when we were members of the European Union, got to grips with the European Parliament. It lacks a direct connection with the voters, lacks, in many eyes, legitimacy, and it was seen as either a part of the exit route for failed politicians or training ground for up-and-coming ones who would go to what really matters in our system, which is the House of Commons, Westminster and Whitehall. So I think it's only among the sort of die-hard Europhiles that people are looking to see whether the ALDE will do better than expected. This is
whether they merge with Macron's new party.
Exactly, and what's happening to the different coalitions on the far right, and will Meloni sit with Orban or move in some other direction, so on. This is a very minority pursuit. We follow the American election far more closely than we follow the European Parliament one. But I think what is true is that only 1 in 3 people think Brexit was a good idea, and that number's dropping all the time. And the overwhelming majority both regret Brexit and, if it was possible, would like to fix our relationship with Europe, both on a trade and investment side, but also on a security and defence and on a cultural and people-to-people side.
So we'll get back to Europe in a moment, but since you mentioned the US election, why don't we turn to that for a moment? What's your over-under right now? Will Trump win?
I think it's too close to call, which is worrying. But in a way, I feel we've been so badly let down by Biden. And actually, we were also pretty badly let down by Obama, that the idea that we're okay if Biden wins and it's disaster if Trump wins, I think is far too simplistic. It was Obama who had the pivot to Asia, who pulled the American armoured troops out of Europe. Under Trump, despite all the shenanigans and dreadful rhetoric and so on, actually the European presence in the American presence in Europe strengthened. And I think that amid Trump's rebarbative rhetoric, there are some quite important points when he's saying we won't defend you if you don't spend 2%. There's also the implied commitment that if you do spend 2%, we will defend you. So I think it's too simplistic to say Trump will pull out of NATO. There's certainly a risk of that, but we've also seen the American guarantee to Europe weakening under Biden and Jake Sullivan. And if Ukraine fails in this war, it will largely be because the American political system failed, not only in terms of the congressional Republicans failing to vote on the latest package, but also on the administration failing to deliver the long-range precision strikes that the Ukrainians needed, and when they were delivered, delivering them with caveats which they couldn't be used effectively.
If the equipment machinery that we've now delivered to Ukraine had been delivered in 2022, the war would long be over.
Yeah. I mean, Ukraine could have won this, and we made sure they didn't.
Yep. We'll talk in a moment about how Estonians and those on the continent feel about, or how we feel about what might happen under the Trump administration. But what about the UK? I mean, do British security policy thinkers worry about a Trump administration from the perspective of the core national interest of the UK, or do you feel that you're safe and secure enough in old Albion with your own nuclear deterrent and so on and so forth, that it's more a question of your geopolitical interests and your allies on the continent and across the world?
There's a kind of paradox that our armed forces are in terrible shape at the moment. We have the smallest army since the Napoleonic Wars with a recruitment crisis. We have grave weaknesses in our stockpiles. We have a lot of out-of-date equipment or new equipment that doesn't work. We have 2 huge aircraft carriers which seem perpetually unseaworthy and which don't really fit the rest of the mission, and there's a fundamental dilemma between do we really try and go all in to defend Europe, or do we try and maintain this sort of global presence, scampering behind the United States and trying to be a sort of peer ally for them and failing to do so. Yet, despite all that, we're still big potatoes compared with the rest of Europe. And for many European countries, their relationship with Britain in defence and security is extremely important. And we are part of this important new initiative with Australia, AUKUS, which is in the long run supposedly going to give Australia nuclear-powered submarines, although not submarines with nuclear weapons. So we're both a global player and panting, sweating and staggering under the burden of our responsibilities, and we don't spend enough. We've got to spend more.
And so perhaps belatedly, but from the continent, we look at, of course, the risks around the US, but also the situation you're describing in the UK, and conclude Europe needs to do much more for its defense, not just in a NATO context, not just individually, but also collectively as the European Union. And that has led to an interesting shift, or maybe even a realignment, in how countries like Estonia look at the question of a separate European capability and a separate sort of European Union line of work when it comes to security and defense, where when these ideas were proposed 5 or 10 years ago, we rolled our eyes and we viewed them as sort of reflexive German or French anti-Americanism. And now you see Estonia being one of the strongest proponents of a stronger EU defense capability. The Reform Party, which traditionally has been quite hawkish on deficit spending and on any form of European debt instruments, has in its platform issuing 100 billion euros in bonds to build up defense capabilities across Europe. It's an interesting paradox that suddenly we've all started marching to the tune of Emmanuel Macron.
Yes, and the main responsibility for this is actually the United States, and the United States has destroyed the fundamental premises on which the Atlantic Alliance was based, and that means we now have to accept, for all its disadvantages, mercantilism, the priorities of the French arms industry, the wobbly, to put it mildly, decision-making in Europe. That is the plan B, and we have to work with that. And I don't think plan A of straightforward dependence on the United States is ever going to come back again. Sadly or not sadly, that era is over. And we need, I think, to do a great deal more, not so much in spending, but in decision-making and particularly prioritisation. It's interesting that if you look at the countries around the Baltic Sea, leaving out Germany, just Poland, the Nordics and the Baltics, they have a GDP that is larger than Russia. Now, Russia has more because of purchasing power parity. They get more rumble for the ruble in Russia, but still just those countries. And they have a defence budget which is between maybe a half and a third of Russia's, but Russia has to do everything. It has to fight a war in Ukraine. It needs to have a military space program, strategic nukes, blue water navy, worry about the Pacific and the Arctic and everything. These countries basically just have to defend themselves. So this is not a problem of means. This is a problem of willpower and coordination. And the good thing about that is that we could do this if we wanted to. Europe is big enough and rich enough to defend itself. Ideally with Britain and Turkey, but even the EU could perfectly well do this if they wanted to. But we have to be willing to make sacrifices and accept risk, and at the moment we're not willing to do that. There's a second issue which is very important, which is what is our attitude to China. And if we want to keep the Americans in Europe, we have to help the Americans on China. And that, I think, is something that has yet to hit home to many European leaders.
Yeah, we'll get to all of that. I want to start with the question of political will and determination. What's your assessment? Glass half full, half empty on France, on Germany. Clearly we're in a place now that is, from an Estonian perspective, much better than it was before the war in Ukraine. But is the are the Wende and Macron sort of come to Jesus moments? How seriously do you take them?
I never like this idea of one glass. I think there are lots of glasses on the bar. Some of them have small amounts of delicious drinks. Other ones are full of stuff that you wouldn't want to drink at all. So I think we should put that metaphor aside. There's some very good things happening. The European Peace Facility, the idea of Europe spending money to support Ukraine, and this is all. There've been amazingly positive developments. Europe getting itself weaned off Russian pipeline gas would have been thought unimaginable only 5-10 years ago. So there's some very good things. On the whole, we are not yet willing, I think, to do the things we have to do. We're doing the things that we like to do. And many of these things have great, unexpected good consequences and make voters happy. But we are not. I think we need boots on the ground in Ukraine, for example. I think Macron was right to float that. I was worried how quickly the idea was shot down by some other countries. I think we need to accept we have an existential fight with Russia, and we'll either have to win it now with Ukraine on our side and still functioning, or we'll have it later on, probably in this part of the world, without Ukraine, and maybe with Ukraine's resources being conscripted on the Russian side, and that would be much more difficult. That's actually the choice. There aren't any other choices. And I don't feel that Europe yet lives with the sense of existential danger that it should do, and the decisions, therefore, are still in the comfort zone rather than the reality zone.
So what can Estonians and those who perhaps feel that existential fear a little bit better, what can we do to help bring that realization to Brussels, to Paris, to Berlin?
Well, I was very interested to read in your election leaflet, which features you and the many other excellent candidates from the Reform Party, this idea that it's been Estonia's mission to warn the Europeans and to be the sort of Cassandra of Europe. And
being Cassandra is not, the best sort of
well, you didn't use
role.
The word, because you didn't use the word Cassandra, but you've been the voice crying in the wilderness.
And the canary in the coal mine also dies,
Yeah, well, I didn't use that metaphor either. But but you make a big thing of Estonia's role in giving Europe its warnings. And of course, that goes back a long way. And I always like to mention Lennart Meri's speech in Hamburg in, I think, 1994. Which
got reprinted recently, 30th anniversary, so everyone's read it.
Yes, high time. They should have read it earlier and more often. And I wish there was a recording of that speech. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be one. But I think that you're right. And Kaja Kallas has said it's not polite to say, I told you so, but actually your election literature in Estonian is saying to Estonians, vote for us because we did tell them so. And that's a good thing to do. I wish there were more Estonians in the European Parliament. I wish there were more Estonians in positions of responsibility across Europe. And I feel that there's a sort of perverse unwillingness in European circles to have the people in the top jobs who understand the threat best and have the best record of dealing with them, because that might be somehow provocative, and that seems to me very odd.
So how do we, I mean, just as a politician, how do you overcome that psychological block?
Well, I do think that Estonians could do a bit more to polish and to refine their public diplomacy.
Okay.
I mean, I think there's a...
Finally, we've got some critique going here. Please.
Well, no,
say more.
I've often said this, that, I mean, Estonians speak excellent English, functional, often kind of functional 1990s English. If you want to get your message across, you've got to speak English like the Swedes do. And if I could do one thing in Estonia, I would take the top 100, 200 Estonian decision makers, public figures, and put them all through an intensive 1-week course of public presentation. How to give a speech. In English. Do not speak in an Estonian monotone. Lighten up, use your body language a bit. And look at the pronunciation. I mean, one Finnish friend of mine, I said, was asking about a very senior Estonian politician who I won't name here, but asking about this person's English. And my friend said, yes, it's racing driver English. Track was slippery, but I was fast. It's totally comprehensible, it's fine, but if you're trying to get across your point at the Munich Security Conference, you need to do better than that. You need to sound like Carl Bildt. And I can think of people in the Ilves family who have that level of English. Kaja's English is excellent.
Albeit for the Ilves family, unfortunately with a disqualifying American accent, one might ask.
It doesn't matter. Europeans are completely bilingual when it comes to that. But how many Estonians have the ability to speak English the way that Carl Bildt speaks?
The phenomenon that I've experienced here, if we just sort of reflect on why that is, there was a massive effort in the 2000s when we were joining the EU to give everyone fairly good English.
Yes.
And that lifted us from the level where we may have been in the 90s. And that's kind of stalled. Everyone sort of got to good enough and got to this kind of functional English, and no one's really making an effort. So I think the call to action is very much called for.
Well, I would also just point out, Annalena Baerbock, for example. Most Germans who are able to do, you present as if your company's future depends on it in business English. You speak as if your country's future depends on it in what one might call the English of statecraft. It's not enough to have English just to negotiate your fishing quota in a room in Brussels. That's a different level, and Estonia needs to change gear on that.
Anything else you'd counsel us in terms of our public diplomacy?
I think I'd also get away from anniversaries. I mean, I love anniversaries, but I think that there's a looking back to the 100 years of Tartu Peace Treaty, 120 years of Estonian foreign policy, there's a lot of wonderful anniversaries, but we live in quite an ahistorical age, and for most people, you're pitching to don't remember 1990. They barely know what the Soviet Union was. It's great in your eyes, in their eyes. You're just another European country. And this means that this narrative of, only 30 years ago, we were a Soviet Socialist Republic and our PPP per capita is now the same level as Japan, yippee. Well, so what? They don't know that that's good by the standards of Croatia, but bad by the standards of Slovenia. And, this whole sort of East-West discourse is over. And I think that the key...
You think so? I mean...
among the young generation, it's not among the sort of people who think that Kaja Kallas can't be NATO Secretary General because she's East European. That's still an issue. But every year, Estonia is more and more a normal country.
Now, if that's really the case, that's fantastic news. Yeah. Does that translate in your mental model to a French or a British willingness to defend and put its boots on the ground and perhaps spill blood for Estonia in a theoretical war?
I think that for most Brits, it would be an equal question whether we do this for Finland or for Estonia. This is not about being under communism. But just getting back to my previous point, I think you need to sell yourself the way Finland sells itself. And they have very subtle and effective branding, which is changing quite rapidly right now. They're highlighting their resilience, which is something they never used to talk about. But I would like to see, Estonia did very well in making itself the sort of e-governance hub of Europe. I hope that you'll be able to do the same on next generation technology and say we are the e-health capital or the AI innovators. Also, your excellent education system. I mean, I every now and again people say, gosh, Britain is now being beaten by Estonia in literacy or numeracy or something, and I think, well, that's great. Let's could we hear a little bit more on your family policies? The idea that you can retire early if you have a lot of kids, if you're a woman. This is hugely interesting for countries that are facing a demographic squeeze, and I think Estonians sometimes over-focus on the occupation, Lennart Meri, all these sort of fantastic things of regaining independence. The achievements of Estonia right now are also pretty impressive, and you need to talk about them.
So we've been talking about guns. Let's talk about butter, and let's start with the hard part of the butter, the economics. Europe's not doing so hot economically. For that matter, neither is the UK in the last few years. The US has collectively been beating pants off of us. America Inc. is very good at scaling, at bringing large amounts of capital to bear on whatever it's doing strategically, on expanding globally, and of course using technology and integrating new technologies into its work. And China Inc. in a slightly different way is also good at a lot of those things. What do we need to do? And feel free to limit your we to the European Union or the broader Europe that includes the UK to be better at that.
And I think to be honest, this is something economists still argue about, is how do you get the long-term growth rate up? And the traditional answer is spend more on education and infrastructure and do supply-side reforms. But actually, Estonia has pretty good infrastructure. You have amazing supply-side liberalisation, and you're still growing slower than the other two Baltic states. Maybe that's cyclical, but I think we need to keep on thinking about what's the next generation of structural reforms. And I think that probably goes into, first of all, the implementation of AI and how you do that, and don't overregulate, but also don't let it run riot. So there's a big sort of technological piece. I also think there's a big human piece. We need to think what are we trying to do? Is it really GDP growth, or are we trying to get gross national happiness? And how do we build the resilience in the society that makes it stand up to shocks, whether it's pandemic or geopolitical or whatever? We have an epidemic of mental health among young people all over the place. This may or may not be related to smartphones. My friend Jonathan Haidt says it is, but I think we've conducted some pretty dramatic social experiments over the last few years with the introduction of technology, which hasn't necessarily been very effective.
I'm going to walk through these one by one. There's a lot you're throwing out here.
Yeah.
AI, fully agree. I mean, it is at least as significant a paradigm shift in computing as the internet and the PC were in the 90s. And we don't know whether we're wandering into artificial general intelligence, or maybe we'll have another AI winter. But even if no further technological development occurs, just adopting the technologies we have into enterprise and across sort of every sector and line of work will make huge changes to the composition of the workforce, productivity. But again, the question is, which societies are set up to do that faster? And right now, the phenomenon that you observe is U.S. companies large investments, significant resources, and they just sort of perfect. Culturally, it's completely normal, basically, for the CEO to say, "Okay, we're all going to learn this thing now," and a bunch of people who've never done it before just jump in the deep end. Tech companies and elsewhere, and it's particularly the non-tech companies. It's the hotel chains and the fashion brands in the U.S. that are doing this, and you don't observe the same level of hunger for adoption, certainly in Europe, and that's both anecdotally and statistically the case.
And I think we need to. The great stimulus for innovation is competitive intensity, and we have been quite good in Europe at dealing with some forms of monopoly, going after Microsoft for its embedding its
mostly American monopolies, right?
Web browser, but we've also gone after Gazprom, and that's been good. But I think that we have not said that creative destruction is a strategic goal, and that Schumpeterian creative destruction, the idea that if land or labour or capital is badly employed, that's is as an atrocious weakness as a pile of perfectly good food rotting in the sun. We should feel offended by land, labour and capital being badly employed, and we should be encouraging the competitive pressure that makes it go to better uses. And I think the sort of European social model is not geared up to welcome creative destruction. It is in some countries. I think the Scandinavian countries, the trade unions, Scandinavian countries say we don't want our members to be in bad jobs, so we want bad jobs to end and bad companies to close, and we know that the state will support us our members while they find new jobs. But we need to elevate competitive intensity and a creative destruction in order to get our companies doing this. We also need to apply the same sort of creative destruction and competitive intensity to the public sector, and that's much harder. And I know, back in the second Mark Lahr government, I remember the Prime Minister's office demanded that every bit of the public sector count on its income and expenditure accounts the cost of the land that they were using. It suddenly became clear that some ministries had enormous amounts of land that were in highly unproductive use, and they were suddenly having to pay for it. And that meant they very rapidly started shifting that land off their books and into some, either renting it out or finding some other use for it. But we need that sort of approach.
So here in the EU, we're gearing up for a discussion on what it is that we need to do for Europe's competitiveness and to sort of keep on deepening the single market, which is supposed to be our instrument of creative destruction, although it doesn't always turn out to be that way. Enrico Letta, the former Italian prime minister, has put forth a whole bunch of proposals. President Macron has endorsed a lot of this, but of course added a sheen of talking about European sovereignty on top of that. And I think there's a realization that some of these things you talk about needs to happen, but we're also, because of the security environment we find ourselves in and the increasing isolationism of the US and China and that sort of new Cold War, at the same time looking a lot, proposing economic policies that remind us a lot of 70s and 80s French dirigism. And
this is the great paradox that we have, on the one hand, a need for more competitive intensity. On the other hand, we're closing down competition on the grounds that we need to build supply chain resilience. And so if you are a slightly inefficient producer of, say, rare earths somewhere in the Western world, you're going to find yourself cushioned with...
Including in Sillamäe and Ida-Virumaa.
I've been to the cinema plant. I don't think it's, I wouldn't accuse it of being inefficient, but they are in a favourable strategic position. And so you've got a problem that what you would be trying to do from the point of view of competition, you're trying not to do from a point of national security. And I think there is a way of squaring that circle, which is saying we may have to restrict competition from China for geopolitical reasons, but let's counterbalance that by intensifying competition in our domestic market and make sure that we don't get just one provider of whatever it is we're trying to build resilience, but several, and make sure that they're competing hard with each other. But we have to start by just acknowledging there is a tension between our two objectives.
And do you think that the UK can be part of that brutal, destructive intra-European competition?
I think that the UK's economic performance since Brexit has been fairly weak, although European performance has also been weak for perhaps other reasons. I think that there are areas in which the EU and the UK still compete quite hard, particularly in
let me ask this more explicitly. We're in a situation now where you're not in the common market, and we sort of don't have too many trade barriers, but you've gone your own way. I know your position. You'd love to come back lock, stock, and barrel. But looking at the art of the possible, do you think there's a window of opportunity where this European focus on supply chains, increasing its resilience, also opens a window for a bit of a rapprochement with the UK? Because we realize that there are a lot of risks around the US right now, and of course there are all the challenges we have with China. I would say a reasonable risk assessment, certainly sitting in Tallinn, perhaps also sitting in Brussels, sees fewer risks from closer intertwining with the UK.
I think that there's enormous potential to improve the relationship. There are also some obstacles. One is psychological, that the withdrawal negotiations are pretty traumatic. Nobody wants to go through that again. And I think the Europeans need to be clear in their minds that there's not going to be another British psychodrama. I can't put my hand on my heart and say that the British psychodrama is completely over. So I think the first step is to do some rather more modest things to rebuild trust and cooperation, like giving Europeans the right to study at British universities, paying British fees rather than the same fees that Americans or Chinese pay. I think we can improve a whole load of things, like how we organise border crossings and rules of pets and things like that, and visas for bands and exhibitions when they want to go abroad. It was easier for the Beatles to go to Hamburg in the 1960s than it is for a British pop group to go abroad now. So there's plenty to do on that front. But I think that the main sort of medium-term goal should be an association agreement. Now, the EU broke its own rules with Ukraine for very good geopolitical reasons, and Ukraine has sort of preferential partial access to the single market without free movement of labour, in this case because the Europeans don't want Ukrainian labour going in unregulated, when in fact the Ukrainians don't want that either. So if you can break or bend or adapt the rules for Ukraine for geopolitical reasons, you can do it with Britain, for the UK for geopolitical reasons. And I think that would be a good goal for the first 5 years of the next Parliament. That would give us better trade and investment relations, which would benefit both sides. And it would be we can also intensify our political cooperation. And then I think perhaps in the second Parliament we can then look for something else. But by then, of course, the EU will have evolved, and not everyone in the EU wants to integrate at the same rate. So maybe you have an inner core of tightly integrated EU countries and an outer slice of less tightly integrated ones into which Britain can fit more easily.
Which slice do you think Estonia should aim to fit into?
It's tricky for Estonia because you, on the one hand, always want to be a member of every club that's going, and you want to be in the middle of that club making decisions, because as a small country, if you're not in there making decisions, the decisions will be made about you. On the other hand, your growth model involves having some pretty distinctive approaches, not least taxes, as Kai has been making clear recently. So you don't want to go for a lowest common denominator Europe, where your competitive advantages get eroded in the name of unity. So that would be a big, tough one for politicians to look at.
I mean, what if that's on offer? I mean, what if the cost of European unity, the cost of European coherence on security and defense, the deepening of a bunch of markets where we think we might have some competitive advantages, is that we have to give up some of our old red lines on taxation and fiscal policy?
Well, that's politics.
And I'm not proposing that. I'm just that's politics. How would you look at the trade-off? What are the really deep risks, and where do you think that from the country like Estonia might be more flexible or give up some of its dogmas without broaching its sort of core advantages or interests?
I think it would be presumptuous for an outsider to give Estonians advice on that. I like the simplicity of the Estonian tax system, so I think keeping it as flat as possible is very important, and I would argue that's probably more important than the exact percentage of the tax rate. My own strong instinct is always to try and move away from taxes on hard work and thrift and towards taxes on unearned incomes. I think that the tax on land is an underappreciated element of the Estonian system, and if you're going to shift your tax rates away from corporate income and personal income and towards the value of land, I think that would be a good idea, and might also do something about the spiralling land prices in the Tallinn area, which
that shift's underway, and of course to much opprobrium.
Yes, well, I think it's maybe people who live around Tallinn won't like it, but it wasn't their genius that made their land double or triple in value. It was the fact that Estonia was successful and Tallinn's become the hub. So I think it's only right that they should pay more for that. And if you drive land prices down, you encourage, you make land more accessible for other uses and stimulate its rational development. Don't build mansions, build blocks of flats. So I'm afraid I'm a hardline liberal in the old-fashioned 19th century sense on this, and I like land taxes and I want more of them, and I don't care if it costs you votes in one place, it'll gain you votes in another.
It's a very good video clip. We're going to cut that and reuse it. Edward Luukas endorses land taxes. I promised to talk about China a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So, Estonians have their old joke about China. We're really looking forward to having a shared border between China, because it means there's no Russia there. We're very much focused on the immediate threat, and I think that we realize geopolitically that the China concern is out there, and we've been much more hawkish than some European countries have. But I don't see the type of coalition. You talked before about how we need to become hawkish on China to keep the Americans in. I don't see the same willingness across Europe to do that. Certainly we talk about it, and then the concern is there, and we're doing, we're doing the work we need to do in areas where technological dependence is a real problem. So moving beyond telecoms equipment to other sensitive areas. But at the same time, for the moment, China is a very different type of actor to Russia in terms of global geopolitics, even though they seem to be getting more and more aligned. What are the prospects you see for a proper transatlantic global liberal coalition that is consolidated and coherent on China?
I think the first thing to worry about is the prospect of a Trump administration taking a kind of sort of pseudo-Kissingerian approach and saying, let's give the Russians what they want in order to get them on side against China. That seems to be what Tom Graham was arguing in his book called Getting Russia Right.
That sounds like Putin's proposal for a Eurasian security architecture.
And we should be worried about that. Obviously, from an Estonian point of view, you should be very worried about it. But there are voices in America, often for, I think, kind of lightly disguised racist reasons, who say there is this big white Christian country with nuclear weapons who we've alienated. Why can't we get them on our side?
They haven't followed the part of Putin having 43 meetings with Xi Jinping in the last...
Yes. And well, they see that they would argue that Russia's falling into the arms of China because of our kind of ridiculous anti-Russia policy, and therefore, supposedly, we need to reverse that, and that the Russians don't really like the Chinese any more than we do. So let's try and do something about that. So I think we want to try and head that one off at the pass. I think that the Americans' ask on China is, for most countries, is not about sending your navy to the South China Sea to traverse the Taiwan Straits and help the Philippines fend off Chinese coast guards. Yeah, there are countries, France and Britain, who may be used from that, but in the end, that's the US Navy's job, and the vast majority of the heavy lift is done by the American military, not us. What they want from us is other stuff. I think.
Well, what they want is they want the exclusion of Chinese companies, Chinese equipment, Chinese services, which then always brings us back to the question: well, what about the inclusion of European companies, equipment, and services in the U.S. market?
Exactly. So there's a bargain to be done there, and we had the beginnings of an excellent architecture with the TPP and the and TTIP.
I was just going to say the world was wonderful around 2015.
It was a bit earlier than that, but there was a time, if Obama had really pushed TTIP and TPP, we'd have ended up with the vast majority of the industrialized free world, democratic world, all in the same two big trade agreements with China on the outside, and we'd have been able to set rules on everything from supply chains to AI and everything else. And we had that opportunity, and we blew it. And we didn't blow it because someone put a gun to our head and said, don't do this. We did it to ourselves because we were lazy and greedy and stupid and short-term and all the rest of it. So now we've got to try and repair things. There is the sort of post-TTIP comprehensive Pacific trade partnership, which maybe some European countries can join. Britain certainly on the way into that. But anyway, there's a whole lump on economics, which is basically about bargaining. I think there's also another thing which is we haven't touched on, which is super important. We can't win these East-West things unless we get the North-South stuff right. And we're getting the North-South stuff really wrong. And there are lots of the big democracies, Brazil, Nigeria, Kenya, Indonesia, I could go on, South Africa, don't see things the Western way. And it's not that they don't like democracy. They like democracy. They dislike the way we don't live up to our standards. They think we are hypocritical and incompetent. And whether it's on voting rights in international organizations, the way that international trade works, on pandemic response, intellectual property, climate change, you go on and on and on. Again and again, they say, hey, we are big, important countries. We're poorer than you. The rules are unfair. What are you going to do? And we say, yes, we hear you, but you have to wait. And then we come to them over Ukraine, say, hey, we've got this urgent problem. You have to do stuff for us right now. And they go, where were you when we needed you? And they're right to say that. So I think that the biggest strategic direction we should have, both whether it's dealing with Russia or with China, is to try and fix the North-South stuff. And that's something where the EU, with its enormous development budget and huge colonial legacy, is very well placed.
But one would also hope private capital and sort of entrepreneurship and innovation, because in my experience, things done from development budgets go a lot less far than things done from proper capitalistic innovations.
Most development finance hasn't worked very well, but there's all sorts of stuff we can do on debt relief, for example, or the
digital government capacity building.
But actually also on infrastructure, and this idea when the Chinese come, they bring a Dow, a road or a railway, and when you come, you bring a lecture.
Yeah, I think we've talked about Team Europe getting better at being Team Europe, and Estonia has its sort of pole position, but its position it always plays with as the digital government country. But it is, as an aside, it's really quite remarkable. There is nary a South country, at least on the more democratic side today, who doesn't have some kind of digital government related relationship of some kind, or prospects of doing something with Estonia.
Yes, and I hear Estonia spoken of when I talk to decision makers from so-called global South countries. And I don't like the term, I use it only reluctantly. They like Estonia, and I think one thing that you can, when this is perhaps where history does kick in, you can say we're a country which has not quite living memory, but a very recent memory of effectively slavery. That's why Estonians don't have a wide variety of surnames, because they used to be serfs.
I think that, the challenge here and the deal to be done, as it were, is not having that be a one-off thing. It's wonderful that Estonia's got all these great relations, but to put that together with the French and the German and the British team,
that's absolutely. Yeah, but I think this idea of trying to leverage the ex-communist experience into an anti-colonial or post-colonial discourse is quite important, and that's underappreciated. Along
with the Ukrainians,
particularly. But I think that this. We have not yet integrated the North-South dimension into our East-West security worries, and that would be something where Estonians in the European Parliament, for example, could put their hand on the tiller and maybe move it a few notches.
So just to wrap things up, when are the British elections?
We don't know. In our system, it's whenever the Prime Minister calls it, but it has to be by the absolute latest, January the 25th.
So you're looking forward to campaigning in the rain and the snow and the sleet?
Even in London, the rain, snow and sleet don't feature much in the summer months. But we did have an election in December 2019, so that's I campaigned in that one, and that was on the chilly side.
Well, Estonian parliamentary elections are miserably in early March, and so all the campaigning happens outdoors in January and February. This time around, we're a bit luckier with the European elections. It's 23 degrees outside right now, beautiful and sunny. So,
well, I do wish you and all my friends in the Reform Party successful campaigning, and I wish that we'd be there in the European Parliament to sit next to you. But I hope that time will come eventually.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Edward.
Thanks. Aitäh.